Long before the modern world knew the walrus as the tusked wanderer of icy seas, there lived their ancient ancestors, creatures larger, more primal, and far more mysterious. The ancient walrus was not confined to the Arctic as its descendants are today. Instead, it roamed coastlines that stretched across distant oceans, from the northern seas of America to the wild waters of Asia, and even further to places far warmer than the frozen homes of modern walruses. They were not merely animals of the ice, but travelers of shifting worlds, shaped by climates that rose and fell with the rhythm of the ice ages. The shores where they gathered were alive with motion. Waves crashed against jagged cliffs, tides pulled endlessly at the sands, and winds carried the cries of seabirds circling above. It was here, upon the cold beaches, that the ancient walruses hauled their massive bodies onto land. Their hides were thick and scarred, marked by battles with rivals and the harsh scrape of ice. Their tusks, though not as enormous as those of their modern descendants, still curved like weapons of bone, gleaming in the dim Arctic light. These tusks were more than tools. They were symbols of power, markers of age, and instruments of survival. With them, the walruses defended territory, fought challengers, and carved paths into icy waters. When they clashed, the sound carried like thunder across the shoreline, echoing off cliffs and waves until it seemed the sea itself trembled. In the water, they were kings. Despite their size, their bodies moved with an elegance that belied their bulk. They glided through frigid waves with surprising speed, their flippers pushing with steady power, their eyes sharp and watchful. Beneath the surface, they hunted, not great predators like saber-toothed cats or dire wolves, but masters of their own domain. They dived deep, their whiskered snouts pressing into the seabed, feeling, searching, stirring clouds of sand until shellfish, clams, and snails revealed themselves. With powerful suction, they pulled the soft bodies from shells, swallowing them whole. For them, the ocean floor was a banquet, and they were its patient, relentless harvesters. Yet the walrus's world was not without peril. Sharks and killer whales prowled the deep, their shadows sweeping across the seabed. When danger struck, the walruses rose in panicked unison, their massive bodies surging upward, crashing through the surface in explosions of spray. Their roars filled the air, guttural and resonant, as they rushed for the safety of land. Their tusks and bulk gave them strength. Few predators dared face a herd of enraged walruses, their tusks slashing, their weight crushing. To challenge them on land was to invite certain death. On the beaches, life was a mixture of chaos and order. Males bellowed and fought for dominance, slamming tusks and bodies against each other in brutal contests. Blood stained the sand, yet the battles were ritual as much as war, deciding who would command the best places among the females, who would rule the center of the herd where protection was strongest. The losers slunk away, wounded and weary, but the victors stood tall, their tusks gleaming with triumph. For the young calves, life was fragile. They clung to their mothers, sheltered beneath the looming shadows of giants. Their cries echoed across the shore, high-pitched against the bass roar of their elders. Seabirds circled overhead, waiting for scraps, and wolves or bears sometimes lingered at the edges of the beach, hoping to snatch a calf left vulnerable. But the herd was vigilant, and many predators learned caution after facing the wrath of tusks and bulk. To live as an ancient walrus was to exist in rhythm with the sea. The tides dictated when they hauled out and when they returned to the water. The seasons determined when food was plentiful and when hunger pressed close. The ice itself was both enemy and ally, breaking apart to grant access to the sea, freezing again to shield them from storms. Their songs carried through it all, deep rumbling calls that echoed across the surf, a language of bonds and warnings, of mothers calling to calves, of males declaring dominance. These sounds became part of the seascape, woven into the cry of gulls and the crash of waves, so that no one who lived along those coasts could ever mistake the presence of the walrus. For early humans who ventured to the coasts, The ancient walrus was a being both feared and revered. Its tusks were seen as gifts of the sea, its flesh a feast in times of hunger, its presence a sign of the ocean's bounty. Hunters watched from a distance, knowing that to face a walrus herd was to risk death, but also knowing that those who succeeded could feed a village. Slowly, across generations, the walrus entered their myths. It became a guardian of the coast, a spirit of endurance, a creature that bridged the worlds of sea and land. Its image was carved into bone and stone, its tusks carried as symbols of strength, its life remembered in story. In this way, the ancient walrus became more than just an animal. It became part of the human story, just as it was part of the ocean story, just as it was part of the earth story. It was a creature forged by the rise and fall of ice, by the eternal push of tides, by the endless struggle for survival. And though many of its kind would fade with the shifting world, its descendants would carry its legacy forward, surviving still on the edges of the ice, reminding us that the ocean remembers. The world of the ancient walrus was not a fixed one. It was a realm of shifting landscapes, where seas rose and fell with the pulse of the Ice Age, where coasts expanded into wide plains only to vanish again beneath encroaching waters. To live in such a world was to adapt endlessly, and the ancient walrus was a master of that adaptation. When the tides retreated, leaving behind vast mudflats rich with life, the walruses followed, hauling themselves across the slippery ground to feed on shellfish buried deep in the muck. Their whiskers twitched constantly, feeling vibrations in the soil, guiding them to hidden prey. They dug with tusks, churned with flippers, and consumed with relentless hunger, turning mudflats into hunting grounds. But when the seas surged back, swallowing the coasts with salt water, the walruses did not resist. They slipped into the waves, moving like shadows beneath the surface, their bodies buoyed by currents, their eyes alert to dangers below. The ocean itself became their ally, offering food, safety, and endless space. It was a shifting balance between land and water, a rhythm of survival that repeated across generations. Seasons marked the flow of their lives. In spring, the herds grew restless as the ice broke apart, fragments drifting across the surface like shattered glass. The walruses followed the retreating ice, for where the ice broke, sunlight returned, and with sunlight came life. Algae bloomed beneath the surface, feeding fish and shellfish, creating abundance for the walruses to harvest. Calves were born in this season, their cries joining the cacophony of gulls and roaring males, their fragile forms nurtured by the warmth of their mothers' bodies. Summer was the time of strength, when food was plentiful and the herds gathered in enormous numbers upon the shores. The beaches became kingdoms of tusks and roars, crowded with bodies pressed together in noisy defiance of predators. From a distance, the sight was overwhelming. Thousands of walruses sprawling across sand and stone, their hides gleaming with oil, their tusks flashing like ivory blades. The air was heavy with the scent of salt, sweat, and blood, a reminder that survival was not gentle. Battles between males were fierce, driven by the urgency of claiming mates. Tusks clashed with a force that split skin and cracked bone, their roars carrying like thunder. The sand ran dark where blood fell, yet the battles were essential, for in these contests the strongest proved themselves, and strength meant survival. Autumn was the season of migration, when storms swept across the seas and the walruses moved with them. They traveled in great herds, riding currents, vanishing from one coast only to appear on another. Early humans who watched their movements learned to predict them, for the walruses were tied to the same cycles of fish and shellfish that humans depended on. To follow the walruses was to follow the promise of food. And then came winter, the harshest season of all. Ice returned with crushing force, sealing coasts beneath white sheets, freezing rivers, locking the seas in silence. For the walruses, winter was both prison and shield. They hauled out onto ice floes, their bodies huddled close for warmth, calves nestled in the center of the herd where the cold could not touch them. Their tusks pierced through ice as they carved breathing holes, their bodies sliding in and out of freezing water, always on the edge of survival. Killer whales prowled these waters, circling like phantoms, their dark fins slicing through the ice-choked seas. Sharks too hunted in deeper waters, drawn by the scent of blood whenever a walrus was wounded. Yet the herd endured, bound by numbers, defended by tusks, their roars echoing across the frozen horizon. Their survival was not merely instinct, it was culture, passed down in the rhythm of migrations, in the shared vigilance of the herd, in the deep songs that resonated through water and air alike. To be a walrus was to belong to something greater, to a community that guarded its young, that mourned its dead, that fought as one. And as the centuries passed, their story became etched into the very fabric of the Ice Age coasts. This was a story of survival, not against the sea, but with it, not against the ice, but through it. They were the guardians of the tide, the tusked wanderers of an ever-changing world, and they thrived where many others faltered. In their endurance, they became a living symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the harshest worlds, life finds a way to endure. The ancient walrus was more than a creature of tusks and blubber. It was a creature of sound, a living instrument of the Ice Age seas. Across the frozen coasts, their voices rose like thunder, low bellows that rolled across the waves, mingling with the crashing surf and the distant calls of seabirds. To hear a walrus herd was to hear the pulse of the Arctic itself. Each call carried, meaning mothers summoned their calves with gentle grunts. Males challenged rivals with deep, booming roars, and the herd sang together in a chorus that echoed far beyond the horizon. Beneath the surface of the sea, their voices changed, growing stranger, almost otherworldly. In the dark currents below the ice, they sang in tones that rippled like vibrations, songs that carried across vast distances, allowing one herd to hear another many miles away. These songs were not random, they were maps, warnings, invitations, and memories all woven into sound. To the walruses, sound was survival, for in a world where ice could shift without warning, where predators lurked unseen, where the sea was vast and unforgiving, their voices tethered them to one another. Early humans who lived along the coast came to know these voices well. To them, the walrus was both a rival and a gift. When the songs rolled across the waves, the hunters listened, knowing the herds were near. They followed the sound, creeping along icy cliffs, their eyes sharp for movement on the beaches below. To kill a walrus was no easy task, for a wounded giant could crush a hunter with a single strike of its tusk, and a herd could stampede into the sea with enough force to overturn boats. Yet the humans persisted, for the walrus was a treasure trove of survival. Its blubber burned as fuel against the long, cold nights. Its hide stretched into tents that shielded families from the winds, its tusks carved into tools and symbols of power. But there was reverence too, for the walrus was not merely prey, it was a spirit of the sea, a guardian of the tide. Their songs were woven into human myths, their battles told in stories by firelight, their bones set into sacred places where land met ocean. To the people of the Ice Age, the walrus was not just an animal. It was a bridge between worlds, between human and ocean, between survival and reverence. And so the voices of the walruses carried across time, not only in the air, but in memory, their echoes surviving long after the glaciers retreated. For those who listened, their calls were not mere sounds. They were history itself, living and breathing through tusked giants who had endured since the dawn of ice, that on the icy coast where glaciers met the sea, the ancient walrus stood not as a solitary creature, but as part of a kingdom defined by strength, sound, and sheer resilience. Yet within this kingdom, peace was never permanent. The males, vast and scarred from countless battles, clashed with one another in displays of raw power that shook the very shoreline. With tusks like ivory spears, they lunged, collided, and shoved, the sound of bone striking bone echoing across the frosted cliffs. Their roars filled the frozen air, mixing with the cries of gulls wheeling above, creating a symphony of conflict that spoke of dominance, lineage, and survival. Each battle was more than blood and fury. It was a test of endurance. A challenger would rise from the icy surf, water dripping from his hide, muscles trembling with tension, and confront the reigning bull who held the beach. The two would circle, their eyes locked in a primal contest that stretched back through countless generations. Then, with a sudden lunge, tusks would scrape against hide, striking with such force that sparks seemed to fly in the imagination of those who watched. Sometimes blood streaked the ice as one male yielded, retreating into the sea with wounds that would scar into stories etched on his body forever. Other times, the battle lasted until both bulls collapsed, too weary to fight, their breaths steaming in the cold night air. The victor did not merely win a patch of beach. He claimed a throne, a place where females gathered to birth the next generation of the Walrus clan. These contests shaped the herd, ensuring that only the strongest, the most resilient, the most cunning of bulls would pass on their legacy. But the battles were not without cost. Many bulls bore broken tusks, shattered ribs, and torn hides. Some never rose again, their bodies claimed by the tide, feeding the ocean that had given them life. To witness such a clash was to understand the brutal poetry of survival in the Ice Age, a cycle of power and vulnerability, of dominance and sacrifice. Early humans who lived along the shores often watched from afar, their hearts pounding as they witnessed the thunder of walrus warfare. To them, these battles were more than animal conflict. They were omens, stories etched in flesh and ivory. The scars of a walrus bull became symbols of endurance, and hunters believed that to take such a creature was to absorb its strength. But the walruses themselves cared little for human eyes. Their battles were for the herd, for survival, for the tides that had shaped them. And when the roars faded, when the victorious bull lay exhausted on the ice, surrounded by the herd that accepted his reign, the sea continued its endless rhythm, indifferent yet eternal. These clashes of titans were not interruptions in the life of the walrus. They were the very heartbeat of their existence, echoing through centuries of ice, blood, and salt. Amidst the fury of battle and the harsh trials of the Ice Age seas, life continued in quiet, tender moments that revealed another side of the ancient walrus. Beyond the roars of bulls and the clash of tusks, the future of the species rested in the fragile forms of calves, born on the frozen shores where glaciers towered like walls of glass. A mother walrus, immense and powerful, became a fortress for her calf. Her thick hide shielded the little one from biting winds, her body warmth a beacon against the unforgiving cold. When the calf first entered the world, it was greeted not by silence, but by a chorus, the low grunts of its mother, the calls of nearby females, and the distant crash of waves that seemed to welcome another voice to the icy symphony. The calf's first cries were high-pitched, filled with urgency, as if it already knew the dangers waiting just beyond the herd. From that moment, survival was a lesson taught hour by hour. Mothers guided their young into the shallows, teaching them to navigate the freezing waters, to dive and resurface, to listen to the vibrations of the herd's calls. Each calf was a student of the sea, its first strokes clumsy but filled with determination. The ancient walrus mothers were patient yet fierce. Any predator that dared to approach, whether an ice age bear wandering the shoreline or an orca lurking beneath the waves, faced a wall of tusks and muscle. Females banded together, forming living barricades around their calves, their roars shaking the icy cliffs. In these moments, the walrus herd was more than a gathering of animals. It was a living community, bound not only by blood but by survival. The calves grew quickly, their bodies thickening with blubber that would one day shield them from the killing cold, their tiny tusks beginning to emerge like whispers of the battles to come. They played on the ice, slipping and sliding, testing their strength against one another, while their mothers watched with eyes filled with both weariness and pride. For the humans who observed from afar, the sight of a walrus calf was more than a curiosity. It was a reminder of abundance, of continuity, of the endless rhythm of life, even in a world carved by ice. To hunt a mother and calf was a desperate act, often avoided, for it was said to bring misfortune upon those who took such innocence. In the myths whispered by coastal tribes, the spirit of the walrus calf could wander, crying for its mother, and those cries could bring storms or draw predators toward hunters. And so, even amidst hunger and hardship, there was a measure of respect, a boundary etched in myth and morality. The children of ice were not only the hope of the walrus herds, they were symbols of resilience itself. Each calf that survived the first bitter winters became a living testament to endurance, carrying forward the lineage of creatures who had outlasted glaciers and storms. Through them, the story of the walrus was never broken, flowing like the tide into the future. The Ice Age was not ruled by the walrus alone. Along the same coasts where herds gathered, another predator watched with cunning eyes and patient hunger the humans. These early hunters were not as strong as the bulls nor as swift as the orcas, yet their intelligence gave them a power that rivaled even the harshest of the Ice Age predators. They studied the walruses for generations, learning their movements, their weaknesses, their seasons of migration. The hunters knew that in summer, when the ice broke apart and the beaches grew crowded, the walrus herds became vulnerable. On land, the giant beasts were slow and awkward, dragging their massive bodies across the rocks with grunts and groans. It was in these moments that the humans struck, armed with spears tipped with stone, their bodies wrapped in furs. They crept along the cliffs and waited for the right moment. To face a walrus head-on was nearly impossible, for a charging bull could crush bone with its weight or slice through flesh with its tusks. Instead, the hunters used strategy. They drove smaller groups toward narrow passages of beach or ambushed them at low tide when escape into the water was difficult. The hunt was perilous, and many hunters bore scars from the tusks of enraged walruses. Yet the reward was too great to ignore. One walrus could feed an entire tribe, its blubber burned as precious oil, its hide stretched into boats or shelters, its bones shaped into weapons, and its tusks carved into ornaments that carried the weight of status and spirit. The walrus was both sustenance and symbol. Around the fires at night, the hunters told stories of battles with the giants of the shore. They spoke of ancestors who had faced herds and lived, who had stood upon the rocks as waves of tusked beasts thundered past, and who had brought down bulls with a single strike of a spear. Yet there was also respect woven into these tales. The walrus was never seen as mere prey. It was a guardian of the sea, a force to be honored. When a hunt was successful, rituals followed. Songs were sung to thank the spirit of the walrus. Offerings of bone or blood were returned to the ocean, and hunters carried with them the belief that to dishonor the creature was to invite misfortune. But survival was never without cost. The walruses, too, learned from these encounters. They grew wary of the cliffs, suspicious of the winds that carried human scent. Bulls grew more aggressive. Herds moved more quickly into the water at the slightest sign of danger, and the balance between predator and prey shifted like the tides. This ancient struggle between human ingenuity and walrus resilience was one of the many threads that shaped the Ice Age world. For on those frozen shores, survival was not a gift but a battle, and both hunter and hunted played their roles in a cycle older than memory. The walrus gave life to the humans, and in return, the humans gave the walrus a place in story, myth, and reverence, binding their destinies together in the endless dance of sea and ice. Beneath the surface of the Ice Age seas, a different battlefield stretched wide and cold, a realm where survival was decided in moments of speed and strength. The walrus, though a master of the shore, was not safe in the dark waters. For here lurked a predator far more powerful than any human or polar bear, the orca. These ancient orcas were larger and more aggressive than the ones we know today. They moved like shadows under the ice, their black bodies blending with the gloom, their white markings flashing only when they surged toward prey. A walrus might feel safe among its herd, packed tightly on the ice, but the moment it slipped into the water, entered the domain of these hunters. The orcas hunted with intelligence, using strategy as sharp as their teeth. They struck in groups, driving walruses away from the safety of the herd. A single bull, massive as it was, became vulnerable when surrounded by swift predators darting from all sides. The orcas lunged at the flanks, toward the soft flesh beneath the thick hide, and forced the walrus into exhaustion. The ocean boiled with violence as the giants clashed. Walruses bellowed underwater, their deep roars muffled by the sea, tusks slashing blindly against the dark. Sometimes a bull would fight with such fury that even the orcas backed away, scarred and bleeding, unwilling to lose more than they gained. Yet more often the sea ran red, the body of a fallen walrus dragged into the depths where the hunters fed. But the walruses were not without their defenses. Their herds did not break easily, and when danger approached, they clustered together tightly, forming a living wall of tusks. Mothers shielded calves in the center, while the bulls circled on the outside, their tusks gleaming as warnings to the predators that dared to draw near. There were times when this unity turned the tide, when orcas were forced to scatter, their sleek bodies slipping back into the darkness, defeated for the moment by the sheer determination of the walrus herd. For both sides, it was a war without end. The orcas needed to hunt to survive, and the walruses needed to enter the water to feed on clams buried in the seafloor. Every dive carried risk, every ripple in the water a reminder of unseen danger. Yet this struggle, violent as it was, shaped the resilience of the walrus. They grew tougher, more cautious, more united, for only those herds that adapted could endure. The Ice Age was a crucible, a place where the clash of titans forged the will to survive, and beneath the waves of the ancient seas, the walrus and the orca wrote one of the fiercest chapters in that endless story of life and death. Amidst the brutal cold and the endless battles that defined the Ice Age world, there existed moments of quiet tenderness that told a different story about the ancient walrus. Though their tusks and massive bodies made them appear as living fortresses, within their herds beat the soft rhythm of mothers caring for their young. These mothers, the matriarchs of the ice, carried the responsibility of ensuring that the next generation would endure the harshest age the earth had ever known. Calves were born on frozen shores where glaciers loomed like mountains of glass and the winds cut sharp as blades. At birth, a walrus calf was small compared to its mother, but even in those first fragile moments, its spirit was fierce. The mother leaned close, her breath steaming in the frozen air, and touched her calf with her whiskers, a gesture that carried both warmth and recognition. For the calf, this touch was the first lesson of life, a promise of protection. The sea, though dangerous, was the calf's classroom, and the mother was its teacher. She guided it into the shallows, supporting it as it splashed awkwardly, learning to float, to dive, and to rise again. The calf's first attempts were clumsy, but with each day it grew stronger, its muscles firming, its body gaining the blubber needed to resist the killing cold of the northern waters. Yet survival was never guaranteed. Orcas prowled offshore, bears roamed the land, and even hunger could claim the weak. To protect their young, walrus mothers joined together. When predators came, they moved as one, forming circles around the calves with their massive bodies and tusks angled outward like a living fortress. Their roars thundered across the ice, echoing against cliffs, a warning that few dared to test. In these defenses, the calves learned not only safety, but also the strength of unity. Humans who witnessed these scenes from afar carried stories back to their camps. They spoke of the walrus mother's cries that rolled across the water like songs, low, mournful, and powerful. Some tribes believed these calls were sacred, gifts of the sea itself, teaching that care and protection were as vital as strength and courage. Hunters, even when driven by hunger, hesitated to kill a mother and her calf, for it was said that the sea spirits would curse those who broke such bonds. In their myths, calves lost to hunters or predators would wander the waves as voices of storms, calling for their mothers until thunder answered. And so the walrus, already a symbol of endurance, became in human memory also a symbol of motherhood, of sacrifice, of eternal care. The calves grew year by year, their tusks breaking through like pale promises of battles ahead, their bodies thickening with the weight of survival. They played along the edges of the herd, sliding over ice, wrestling gently, testing the strength they would one day need. Each calf that survived its first winters was a victory, not just for its mother, but for the entire herd, for in the survival of the calves lay the survival of the species. The songs of the mothers, carried on the cold winds, told this truth across the Ice Age world, that even in a land ruled by predators and storms, the tenderness of care could be as powerful a force as the might of tusks and muscle on the frozen beaches of the north, where jagged icebergs drifted like shattered glass upon the dark sea and the wind howled across desolate plains. The great bulls of the ancient walrus held dominion. They were giants even among their own kind, massive bodies sheathed in thick layers of blubber that rippled as they moved, their tusks long and gleaming, carved not by human hand, but by the slow work of time and hunger and endless survival. These tusks, rising like ivory towers from their faces, were more than weapons. They were emblems of dominance, of rank, of survival against both nature and rivals. When the herds gathered on the icy shores to rest after long hunts beneath the sea, the bulls claimed the choicest places, hauling their massive bulk onto rocks that had been worn smooth by centuries of flesh and bone pressing against them. Their roars carried across the land, low and guttural, a sound so deep it seemed to rumble through the very bones of the earth. Younger males circled these giants cautiously, their tusks shorter, their bodies leaner. The time would come when they would challenge, when blood would stain the ice, and the victor would claim the right to guard the herd. But for now, the great bulls reigned unchallenged. Battles between these colossi were events of raw power and terrible beauty. When two rivals met, the ice shook under their weight, their tusks clashed like swords of ivory, and their roars merged with the crash of waves. They gouged at each other's hides, blubber tearing, blood spraying crimson upon the white snow. The herd gathered in tense silence, calves pressing close to their mothers, young males watching with wide eyes, learning the ways of power. Such duels did not always end in death, but every scar, every broken tusk, was a record written upon their bodies, proof of survival and dominance. The victors, weary but unbroken, lifted their heads and roared to the heavens, a proclamation that the shore belonged to them. To early humans who watched from the cliffs, these scenes were both terrifying and inspiring. They saw in the walrus bulls the embodiment of strength, of dominance, of the eternal struggle for leadership. Some tribes carved images of tusked giants in bone and stone, believing that to honor these animals was to draw upon their power. Hunters told tales of bulls so massive their tusks dragged furrows in the ice, leaving trails that stretched across the tundra like scars. For these humans, to face a bull was to gamble with death, but also to earn glory. Many songs and stories were woven around these giants, casting them as spirits of the shore, guardians of the boundary between sea and land. Yet despite their power, the bulls were not without vulnerability. As the Ice Age waned and the world warmed, the beaches they ruled began to change. Ice melted, waters rose, and the vast expanses of frozen shoreline, where they had fought for generations, began to shrink. The giants of the shore, unchallenged by predators, but challenged by the shifting world itself, found their dominion crumbling beneath them. But in their time of glory, in the height of the Ice Age, they were kings unmatched, rulers of the frozen earth, their tusks catching the pale light of the northern sun, their roars echoing like thunder across the endless, icy seas. High above the rocky coast, where the cliffs met the endless northern sea, a group of humans stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the herds of walruses sprawled below. The ancient walrus, massive and armored in thick skin and blubber, looked almost invincible to these early hunters, their tusks gleaming like carved ivory spears. Yet hunger is a teacher more powerful than fear. And these men and women of the Ice Age had long learned that no creature, no matter how great, was beyond the reach of human cunning. They studied the herd with patient eyes, noting the rhythm of its movements, the way calves nestled close to their mothers, the great bulls bellowing and clashing at the edges. They watched the tide, for it was the tide that gave the hunters their chance. When the water withdrew, leaving the herds clustered tightly upon the rocks, the hunters moved like shadows. They descended from the cliffs, spears clutched tightly, their breath misting in the icy air, their feet finding paths worn by generations of pursuit. For them, the walrus was more than meat. It was life itself. From its flesh came food to feed entire clans. From its blubber came oil to light the long winter nights. From its hide came shelter against the cutting wind, and from its ivory tusks came tools and ornaments that marked rank and identity. To kill a walrus was not merely to survive. It was to carve meaning into existence. But the walruses were not passive prey. As the hunters approached, the bulls lifted their heads, nostrils flaring, eyes narrowing with instinctive wariness. A low rumble spread through the herd, a vibration of unease. The hunters spread out, careful and deliberate, some driving sharp cries into the air to scatter the herd, others circling behind to cut off retreat. Then the chaos erupted. With thunderous bellows, the walruses surged toward the sea, their massive bodies sliding across the rocks like living avalanches. Tusks slashed the air, hides rippled with raw muscle, and the ground shook beneath their retreat. For a hunter caught in their path, there was no survival. Yet in that storm of flesh and fury, the hunters had their chance. They thrust spears at the edges of the herd, targeting the slower calves or weakened adults, knowing that to stand against a full-grown bull was to court certain death. Spears sank into flesh, cries of pain mingled with roars, and the snow grew streaked with red. When the struggle ended, one walrus lay still upon the frozen ground, its massive bulk towering even in death. The hunters gathered around, their breath heavy, their hands trembling not with fear but with reverence. They knelt by the fallen giant, touching its tusks, whispering words of thanks to the spirit that had given itself so their people might endure. The women and children approached, their faces solemn, and the tribe set to work. They stripped the flesh, heavy slabs of meat carried back to the camp on sleds fashioned from bone and wood. The blubber was carved and stored, the ivory tusks lifted with care, destined to become tools, weapons, and symbols. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was taken without purpose. Around their fires that night, they told the story of the hunt, voices rising against the howl of the wind, eyes glittering in the firelight. They spoke of the strength of the walrus, of the courage of the hunters, and of the eternal balance between predator and prey. Children listened with wide eyes, learning that survival was never granted but always earned, and that the walrus, even in death, remained a spirit of power and respect. In time, such hunts became ritual. Songs were sung before the spears were raised, offerings of bone and shell were cast into the sea to honor the spirits of the slain. The walrus was not merely food, that it was woven into the fabric of human existence, a bridge between life and death, between sea and land, between hunger and hope. And so the hunter's gaze, sharp and unyielding, became part of the walrus's world. Each herd upon the shore carried the memory of blood. Each clan by the fire carried the memory of sacrifice. The bond was sealed, eternal and unbreakable, carved into both flesh and story. Beneath the crushing weight of sea ice, where the pale light of the sun could barely penetrate, the ancient walrus moved like a shadow in a silent world. Down here the air above, the storms, the hunters, the roar of waves, all were muffled into a stillness broken only by the crack of shifting ice and the distant calls of seals. This was the other half of the walrus's existence, the realm that shaped its strength and sustained its kind for thousands of years. With their immense bodies and great lungs, walruses could remain submerged far longer than most creatures dared. They slid through the dark waters with surprising grace, their whiskered faces tilted downward as they swept the sea floor in search of food. Their most trusted tools were not their tusks, but the stiff bristles of their whiskers, each one alive with sensation, detecting the faintest movements in the mud. They pressed their muzzles to the seabed, whiskers twitching, feeling for clams buried beneath the sand, for snails and mussels tucked into hidden crevices. When they found their prize, they created a vacuum within their mouths, sucking the soft flesh from its shell with such force that even the strongest clam could not resist. And so, the walrus became the great forager of the northern seas, its survival tied not to speed or violence, but to patience and persistence. Yet this underwater world was far from safe. The walruses were not alone beneath the ice. Silent hunters patrolled these depths, the polar bear that swam with unmatched stealth, the killer whale whose cries echoed through the water, the great sharks of older seas that had yet to vanish from the earth. For a calf, clinging to its mother's side, each dive was a lesson in both nourishment and danger. The mothers kept them close, their bodies pressed against the calves, tusks angled outward in warning. A mother walrus knew no hesitation when her calf was threatened. With her massive bulk, she would place herself between danger and her young, striking with tusks, ramming with her weight, creating chaos in the water until predator and prey alike scattered. Life beneath the ice was also a test of endurance. The cold was absolute, seeping through every crack in the body's armor, numbing the muscles, demanding constant movement to keep the blood alive. The walrus's thick blubber was its shield, a living cloak of warmth that allowed it to endure where others froze. It was a gift of evolution, earned through ages of survival in this merciless domain. In the silence of the deep, the walruses also found communion. They swam in groups, their bodies brushing one another, their calls echoing through the water like distant bells. These calls were more than noise. They were the language of the herd, binding them together in a world where isolation meant death. Calves recognized their mothers by voice alone. Bulls declared their dominance in the dark with rolling bellows, and the herd remained whole even when scattered by currents and storms. And above all, the sea itself was their eternal provider. Every clam dug from the mud, every mussel pried loose, every shell cracked open, these were gifts of the deep, gifts that allowed the walrus to haul itself back onto the ice, to face the winds, to live another day. From the Ice Age, life was always borrowed, never owned. Each dive beneath the ice carried with it a gamble, a choice between nourishment and risk, between the safety of the surface and the perils of the deep. Yet the walruses returned again and again, unyielding, because the sea was their home, and in its cold embrace, they found not only survival, but identity. The ancient walrus was more than a beast of tusks and blubber. It was a creature bound to two worlds, the frozen land above and the dark waters below. Its story was not written in the clash of battles or the roar of predators, but in the quiet endurance of countless dives, in the bond of mother and calf, in the endless quest for food beneath the ice. And in this way, the walrus became not just a creature of survival, but a symbol of resilience itself. But on the frozen coasts where ice met stone and sea, the walruses gathered in their greatest numbers. This was the stage for the bulls, the towering males whose tusks gleamed like ivory spears and whose massive bodies dwarfed all but the largest bears. They were the rulers of these icy realms, not because they were many, but because they were willing to fight for dominance in ways few other creatures could match. When spring arrived and the herds hauled themselves onto rocky shores to breed and rest, the air filled with the deep bellows of bulls announcing their presence. These calls carried far across the coastlines, rolling like thunder, a warning to rivals and a summons to females. Each sound was more than a cry. It was a declaration of power, a claim to territory, a promise of violence to any who dare challenge. Battles between bulls were spectacles of raw strength and ancient ritual. Two males would face one another, their tusks angled forward, their bodies swaying as if measuring the other's resolve. Then, with sudden fury, they would lunge, tusks clashing, heads colliding, their immense bulk crashing together with the force of battering rams. The noise of tusk against tusk echoed across the ice like the cracking of trees in a storm. Blood often stained the snow, dripping from deep gouges carved by tusks or the ragged wounds of torn flesh. Yet these battles were not fought to kill, but to dominate. The weaker bull, bruised and bloodied, would eventually retreat, sliding back into the sea or retreating into the herd, ceding the territory and the right to mate. The victor would bellow triumphantly, his tusks raised high, his wounds a mark of honor in the endless struggle for supremacy. But these fights were never without risk. Many bulls carried scars from years of combat, broken tusks, torn flippers, gashes that healed into thick ridges across their hides. Some bore the limp of an old injury, reminders of battles where victory came at a cost. And sometimes, a bull who pushed too far, too recklessly, would not rise again, his body claimed by the sea or left to the scavengers of the tundra. Yet to the walrus herd, the dominance of bulls was more than violence, it was order. Their battles established hierarchy, ensuring the strongest genes carried forward, ensuring the herd remained resilient in a world that demanded strength above all. Around these mighty males, the females and calves gathered, finding protection in their size and aggression. For even predators thought twice before approaching a herd defended by a dominant bull. These great leaders of the walrus world were not only warriors but guardians, their presence a shield against the perils of the north. At night, when the storms howled across the coast and the auroras shimmered above, the bulls lay among their herds, their tusks glistening in the pale light, silent sentinels of the frozen world. The calves nestled between mothers, the cows huddled close for warmth, and the bulls, still bleeding from their clashes, stood watch, their heavy breaths steaming into the night. In these moments, the walrus herd was more than a collection of animals. It was a kingdom of the ice, bound by survival, led by strength, united by the blood of battles and the bonds of kinship. The bulls of the north were not immortal, but their legacy endured in every calf that lived under their protection, in every herd that followed the path they carved across the icy seas. Their battles, their triumphs, their scars, these were the stories written into the very survival of the walrus kind. And in the silence after the battles, when the sea once again lapped gently against the rocks, the bulls stood as monuments to an ancient truth. That in the Ice Age world, survival was never given, only earned through strength, courage, and an unyielding will to endure in the Ice Age world. Even giants were never free from danger, and the ancient walruses knew this better than most. Though their tusks were formidable weapons and their herds powerful in number, predators of the frozen seas and coasts stalked them relentlessly. Chief among these hunters were the polar bears, lords of the ice, whose patience and cunning made them terrifying adversaries. The polar bear's white coat blended perfectly into the snow and sea ice, allowing it to move unseen until it was almost upon its prey. A hungry bear could stalk a walrus herd for hours, even days, waiting for weakness to show. Calves straying too far from their mothers, injured cows lagging behind the herd, or a bull too exhausted from battle, all became targets. When the moment came, the bear charged with astonishing speed, claws raking the snow, jaws opening wide to clamp down on the thick hide of a walrus. But this was no easy hunt. A walrus could weigh over a ton, and when a herd rallied together, their defense was like a wall of tusks and flesh. Mothers positioned themselves around calves, bulls surged forward with threatening bellows, and sometimes the herd would stampede back into the sea, creating chaos that made it nearly impossible for a bear to secure its kill. Still, polar bears persisted, for the reward of a successful hunt was immense. One walrus carcass could sustain a bear for weeks. If the land brought danger from bears, the sea carried an even greater threat. Killer whales, the silent hunters of the deep, patrolled the waters where walruses swam. They were masters of coordination, striking with intelligence and speed that rivaled any predator on Earth. When a walrus slipped into the water, it entered their realm, where size alone was no guarantee of safety. The orcas often attacked in pods, surrounding a lone walrus or separating calves from their mothers. Their sleek bodies cut through the freezing waters with precision, their haunting calls echoing beneath the waves. Then came the strike, a sudden surge of power, teeth clamping down, pulling the walrus under, thrashing until resistance ended. The sea boiled with violence as the predators feasted, leaving nothing but blood swirling in the icy currents. For the walrus herds, the threat of predators was a constant shadow. They had learned strategies to survive, instinct honed over countless generations. On land, their tusks were shields. In the water, their bulk and thick hides offered some protection. Yet even the mightiest bull, with tusks that gleamed like spears, could not always fend off coordinated killers. It was a brutal truth of the Ice Age. No creature, no matter how massive, was beyond the reach of death. And yet, these constant dangers shaped the walrus into what it became. Their herds grew tighter, their bonds stronger, their instincts sharper. Predation was the force that carved resilience into their bones, that taught calves to fear the shadows and the waves and mothers to guard them with unwavering devotion. The walrus did not survive in spite of predators. It survived because of them, because every day was a lesson in vigilance and endurance. When storms raged across the seas and the auroras flickered above the horizon, the walrus herds gathered together, the scars of battles and hunts etched into their bodies. They were reminders of what it meant to live in a world where survival was always contested, where predators lurked in silence, and where the line between life and death was as thin as the cracking ice. And yet, in that harsh balance, the walrus endured, a titan of the frozen realm, scarred but unbroken, its song of survival echoing across the ages in the vast and unforgiving landscapes of the Ice Age. The future of the walrus herds rested upon the smallest and most vulnerable among them, the calves. Born into a world of cold winds, shifting ice flows, and lurking predators, each calf's first breath was both a triumph and the beginning of a struggle for survival. A walrus calf entered life on the relative safety of pack ice or frozen shores, where its mother had sought refuge far from the dangers of turbulent seas. The moment of birth was quiet but urgent, for the mother's instincts knew that her newborn would need warmth and sustenance immediately if it was to endure the chill that seeped into every corner of this ancient world. The calf, slick with birth fluids, shivered under the cutting winds, and it was the mother's massive body that shielded it from the elements. Her thick skin and layers of blubber became a fortress of warmth, wrapping the fragile life against the bite of the Arctic cold. The bond between mother and calf was instant and unbreakable, a tether that held fast in a world where survival depended on vigilance. Nursing began almost at once, as the calf latched onto its mother's teats and drew in the rich milk that flowed like liquid life itself. Walrus milk was dense and filled with fat, designed to turn the fragile newborn into a sturdy survivor within weeks. Each gulp strengthened muscles, thickened blubber, and gave the calf the energy it would need to follow its herd across treacherous ice fields. For the mother, nursing demanded immense energy, forcing her to forage tirelessly in the frigid seas and return with reserves of strength to pour into her young. Calves grew quickly, but their vulnerability lingered. Their cries carried across the ice like fragile notes, sounds that mothers never ignored. If a calf wandered too far, the mother's deep calls summoned it back, her tusks and body forming a barrier against danger. Yet danger was never far. Polar bears prowled the floes, their keen noses alert for the scent of milk and vulnerability, while gulls circled overhead, ready to harass mothers for scraps of afterbirth. In the water, the calves faced their greatest peril, for orcas and other marine predators could seize them with terrifying ease. It was in these moments that the walrus herd revealed its strength. When a calf was threatened, the herd responded with thunderous unity. Bulls positioned themselves like living shields, their tusks gleaming as they clashed with intruders. Mothers grouped tightly around their young, forming a circle of defense that was as ancient as the herd itself. In the roar of the storm or the silent approach of a predator, the walrus calves learned their first lesson: that survival was not just an individual act, but a communal effort written into their bloodline. The calves themselves were not mere passive dependents. They were curious, learning with every touch of the ice and every plunge into the shallow waters near their mothers. They mimicked feeding behaviors, snuffling into the seabed in search of clams, even when their mouths were not yet skilled enough to dig them free. They practiced swimming in short bursts, awkward flippers flailing until their strokes grew strong and sure. Play among the calves was both joy and education, for it prepared them for the battles of life. Mock tussles with their tiny tusks budding, dives that tested their breath, and games of chase that taught them the agility needed to escape death. Each season marked the growth of a new generation, and with it, the survival of the herd itself. Calves were the heartbeat of the walrus legacy, and the herds moved across the ice in patterns dictated by their protection. The ancient walrus understood, in a way that instinct speaks without words, that without calves there was no future, and so the herd bent its strength to shielding them at all costs. To see a calf nestled at its mother's side, eyes wide with the wonder of a world filled with shadows and light, was to glimpse the promise of endurance. Even in the most brutal winters, when food grew scarce and predators pressed harder than ever, the presence of calves gave the herd a reason to fight, to endure storms, to charge into battles against bears, or plunge into icy waters against orcas. They were the fragile torchbearers of survival, carrying the ancient walrus name forward into the unknown ages to come. The Ice Age calves, born upon frozen lands and into seas that swallowed the unprepared, were not only the smallest of their kind, but also the strongest in spirit. For each step they took upon the frostbound world was a victory over the vast indifference of nature itself. Across the endless frozen seas of the Ice Age world, where wind howled like a restless spirit and waves thundered beneath drifting sheets of ice, there was another sound that echoed with equal power and beauty: the songs of the walrus herds. These were not mere noises, but deep, resonant calls, rhythmic pulses, and haunting bell-like tones that carried across the water and ice, weaving connections between animals scattered across vast distances. In the stillness of twilight, when the horizon burned with the glow of a sun struggling to break through thick clouds, the herd gathered upon a massive floe, and the air grew alive with sound. The bulls, their voices booming and guttural, let loose bellows that rolled like thunder across the sea. Their chests vibrated with each note, and the water around them trembled with the force of their songs. Mothers answered with softer yet equally powerful calls, tones meant not for battle, but for reassurance, for the steady rhythm of life that bound calf to mother and herd to herd. The calves, too, added their own higher-pitched voices, piping notes that fluttered above the deep rumble of the adults like sparks of light against a stormy sky. Together, the herd's chorus became a living symphony, a soundscape that told of strength, of belonging, and of survival. These songs served many purposes. For the bulls, they were declarations of dominance, signals to rivals that here stood a warrior prepared to defend his family and his ice. For mothers, their calls were lullabies that calmed frightened calves in the face of predators and storms. For the herd as a whole, the songs were signals, long-distance messages that could travel for miles beneath the surface of the sea, where sound carried better than sight. In a world where ice could separate groups overnight and storms could swallow vision, these songs were lifelines, guiding herds back together and uniting them in a shared rhythm that spanned the ages. The songs were also tied to ritual and to courtship. During mating seasons, the bulls produced elaborate displays of sound, each one striving to outsing his rivals. Some clicked their tusks against the ice to create sharp staccato beats. Others exhaled bubbles beneath the water that popped and resonated like drums. Still others hummed deep underwater vibrations that rolled through the seafloor itself, reaching females who listened not only with their ears but with their bones, feeling the strength of a bull in every pulse. These vocal battles determined which bull would claim the right to mate, and their echoes carried the story of survival through generations. Beyond rivalry and romance, the songs were a map of memory. Just as human tribes told stories around fire, the walrus herds carried their history through sound. A certain note might warn of the approach of predators, echoing the cries of ancestors who had once battled the same threats. Another rhythm might be a call of migration, guiding the herd along ancient paths etched in instinct but reaffirmed with every season through shared song. In this way, calves learned not only to recognize their mothers, but also to inherit the collective wisdom of the herd. At night, when the stars pierced the frozen heavens and the aurora shimmered across the sky in curtains of green and blue, the songs of the walruses rose into the darkness like prayers. Their deep bellows and haunting tones became part of the cosmic silence, mingling with the sounds of cracking ice and roaring winds. Travelers from distant herds could hear these songs and know the kin waited across the ice. Predators, too, recognized them, but often hesitated, for the sound of a united herd was as intimidating as the flash of tusks. To listen to the walrus herd was to listen to the heartbeat of the Ice Age itself, for their voices carried the same rhythm as the tides, the same timeless pulse as the shifting glaciers. The songs were not simply survival tools. They were declarations of existence. They told the frozen world that life endured, that even against the vast cold and the constant threats, the walrus herds thrived in unity. And when calves nestled beside their mothers and listened, their small ears pressed against the thick folds of skin, they were not merely hearing their family, but absorbing the eternal language of their species, a song that had begun long before their birth and would continue long after, echoing across centuries of ice and sea. Thanks for watching videos and good night.